have to say good morning or good afternoon to everyone. We used to do these at 10:30 in the morning, and we decided to go through, make a time schedule change to 12 o'clock, which worked out good because I had an interesting weekend with the kids this weekend. So I'm glad everybody's doing well. And here this morning, we are going to talk about Civil War soldiers and introduction. And basically, this is an introduction. This is the kind of a topic that you really could spend probably a good 5 hours on, and we have to go out to get something to eat and come back and have another 5 hours after that, and then we have coffee and donuts and everything else. So this is one of those talks I kind of want to kind of introduce everybody to the topic, kind of discuss some of the important points of that, and then open the floor for questions, of course, for anyone who might have a question about what we're going to talk about. And we're going to see if I can. Great. The first slide you see is a title page of the revised regulations of the Army of the United States in 1861. As with anything dealing pertaining to the military, there's always going to be paperwork or some kind of regulations to describe how to deal with prisoners when they're taken in a combat situation, or in most cases with the pre-war Army on the frontier. And in the sense of the Confederate armies, they used the same manual that the U.S. Army used at that time, which is kind of unique if you think about it. It really was a civil war. You've had two armies fighting each other. They used the same regulations, the same drill, the same, in some ways, the same dress in many ways. So really, it's almost, the army is kind of divided in half and it's fighting against each other. Now, when dealing with Civil War prisoners, you need to understand there's going to be paperwork involved dealing with those particular prisoners and the transit of those prisoners from the battlefield to the prison camp and while they're in the prison camp. One of the things we are going to talk about are some of the resources available at the state archives to do research on Civil War prisoners and how to maybe find some information about somebody you may have that was a prisoner of war. Now, this is a photograph. All these photographs I'm going to show today is going to be from the Library of Congress. This is a photograph of the fire zouaves at Castle Pinckney in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina after the first Battle of Manassas. Now, this is back when they first started receiving prisoners as a result of some of the first engagements during the American Civil War. A lot of times they really didn't know what to do with the prisoners. As you can see, these particular fire zouaves, which are down in Charleston, South Carolina, it's basically there's a party going on. And that's what they did. They had the cadets that were guarding them in Castle Pinckney, and they had a good time. They kind of joked around, kidded around, grilled out, things like that. They had, basically, it was not really a war per se. It was more like, this is like halftime of the Super Bowl, and we're all going to go get, grilled hot dogs and stuff like that. Well, a lot of this is because of the newness of the war itself. The war has not become a slaughter pen. It would eventually become, and the strident political views that caused the war did not translate down to the men who were actually fighting the war at this particular time. Now, one thing we want to talk about is the whole idea of how prisoners were taken and how they were passed on to the prisoner of war camps. And this is something that I feel like everybody needs to kind of get an idea on what they need to take a look at. Now, this particular photograph you see in front of us is Confederate Major General George E. Pickett's division after the Battle of Five Forks, Virginia, in April of 1865. As you can tell, the prisoners had just been taken, probably about maybe 2 or 3 hours before this time, and they still have all their accoutrements on them. You see they got their backpacks, they got their blanket rolls on, they got their canteens on. The only thing you don't see, interesting enough, are their muskets. They had recently been disarmed, and these are the prisoners that are getting ready to be moved out to a collection point before they get sent north to a prisoner of war camp. Now, interesting enough, if you see in the middle of the stack, you see a guy with kind of a tall peaked hat. When I used to do reenactments, there was always an argument whether Mexican war equipment showed up in the American Civil War, and we always argued about it, saying no, they didn't, yes, they did, things like that. Well, interesting enough, the guy with the tall peaked hat, you kind of see in the middle of the group, he is actually wearing a Mexican War forage cap, and this is in April of 1865. So, for those who said it didn't happen, we say, basically, 90-90 boo, look at this. So, this is a good photograph of that. So like I said, these prisoners are now lined up getting ready to be moved out to a collection area. Now, one thing we want to talk about while we're talking about the idea of prisoners is the parole process. Now, you're going to hear about the parole process when doing research on Civil War prisoners. And what that is a situation where an army would capture soldiers and they did not have the time or the personnel or the locality to actually store prisoners or move prisoners out of a combat site. So what they would do is they would capture prisoners and they would parole them. Those parole prisoners would be sent to a parole camp. They are required by oath of agreement that they will be in this parole camp for so many months and will not raise arms against the people who captured them. This particular parole was written up by a member of Thomas's Legion. This is actually from PC 36 Stephen Wicker papers. Now, interesting enough, he is talking about going on parole, and his basically ordered by the Confederate government to go back to his unit, to go back and fight in his unit. Now, interesting enough, the Confederate government did not honor paroles as much as the Union Army did. The Union Army, when their troops got captured and paroled, they actually sent them to a parole camp, which is very much similar to a prisoner of war camp. And these guys had to sit there and basically buy their time until their period of parole was over. Then they were released to go back to their units. Interesting enough, the Confederate government did not follow this policy that well. They actually tried to find ways to avoid sending their troops to a parole camp. A really good example is, if anybody's familiar with the Battle of Vicksburg, the capitulation of Vicksburg in July of 1863, a large numbers of the Major General John Pendleton's Army of Mississippi was paroled by Lieutenant General U.S. Grant. Well, as a virtue of being paroled, the Confederate government turned right around and sent these men right back into the Army to fight again. Unfortunately, at that time, a lot of the soldiers did not show up, or once they got into the Army, they actually deserted again. And unfortunately, some of the soldiers got actually sent to Chattanooga and actually served on Lookout Mountain, which is, some of the historians believe that's the reason why the mountain fell so quickly, was because a lot of them was made up of Vicksburg parolees who really just did not want to fight again. Another thing I want to show you, and I'm talking about paroles, I did a blog post back in June of 2013. It seems like 1,000 years ago, doesn't it? On the capture of a order book of the 116th Ohio Volunteer Infantry at the Battle of Winchester. Interesting enough, Colonel James Washburn, who was the commander of this Ohio unit, was actually captured and was paroled. Interesting enough, while he was being captured and was paroled, his wife was also captured and paroled at the same time. When his unit basically fell apart under the organized attack by the Army of Northern Virginia, his wife was in the hospital, in the headquarters train, or the wagon train, and she was actually captured and she was actually paroled by the Confederate Army. And that was a situation where they just did not have the time to deal with the prisoners they were capturing that time at the battlefield. Now, this is a photograph of the Punch Bowl in Northern Virginia, and what this is a collection point for prisoners. When prisoners are actually collected from a battlefield, they will be sent to a consolidation or a collection point before they were moved up north. This is known as the Punch Bowl. A lot of photographs were taken of these. Most of these Confederate prisoners were taken at the Battle of Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse in mid-summer of 1864. As you can imagine, this is the ideal location to store prisoners because all the Union guards were on the top of the hills looking down in the Peach Bowl or the Punch Bowl, and all the prisoners stayed in the Punch Bowl. So if they tried to leave, they would have guards all around them to keep them from leaving. So basically, these men were sent here and were basically held in this particular location before they would move by rail to City Point or to Fredericksburg and be loaded onto ships to be taken north to either Point Lookout or Fort Delaware at the time. Now, some of y'all might have seen this photograph before if you came to some of my earlier talks. The question is this Union prisoners or is this Confederate prisoners? I don't have any free candy to give away, so. Any answers? Okay. These are Confederate prisoners, and if you take a look at them, they're actually wearing Union Army uniforms. They actually took these uniforms from the Union dead at Chickamauga. They fought at Chattanooga, was captured, and once they was captured, they have been sent to a collection point before they get sent north to the Camp Chase or Johnston Island at the railroad depot at Chattanooga. Now, that's the key about these collection points. They're usually at a railroad depot somewhere where they can get men onto a train or onto a ship to take them to a fort somewhere else for incarceration. Now, in the process of doing research on your Civil War ancestor who was captured during the American Civil War, here's an example of one record you may want to take a look at. This is from Record Group 249. We actually had the microfilm for this in the search room of the state archives. This is a descriptive roll from Point Lookout, Maryland. Now what this roll does, it tells you what prisoners were taken. They're arranged in alphabetical order by the name of the soldier, when they were taken, and their date of transit. So if you take a look at the first name on the list, it's James, it starts with a D, I can't read it from here. He is in the Company A of the 40th Alabama. He was captured at Bentonville on March 19th, 1865. If you look over to the right, his date of transit was, he was sent from Goldsboro to New Bern, and he was loaded on ships at New Bern to be sent to Point Lookout. We have these descriptive rolls for Elmira Prison, for Fort Delaware, and for Point Lookout. And they are great if you're trying to find a soldier who might have been captured and who was sent up north to a different prisoner of war camp. Interesting enough, have y'all ever heard of the famous singer or the famous person named Tom Dula that the Kingston Trios sang about? Interesting enough, Tom Dula was captured at the Battle of Kinston, or Wise Forks. His name shows up on the descriptive roll as well as being sent north after being captured at Wise Forks. So it's a great way of finding out when they might have been captured and who captured the particular soldier at that time. Now, once the prisoners arrived in camp, in some cases they were allowed to write home to their relatives and their families requesting assistance. This is from Private Collection 1573, which is the Henry F. Benton papers. This particular soldier was captured at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher in January of 1865. He served in the 2nd North Carolina Artillery or the 36th North Carolina Troops. If you could take a look at the top of the letter, he's basically saying, send me all the U.S. money you have, but keep all the gold and silver. So basically what he's saying is, I'm up north now, and for me to purchase things from the settlers in northern camps had settlers where prisoners could buy goods from, please send me all the U.S. money that you have so I can buy what I need from the settlers on the prisoner camp. As you can tell, he's at Governor's Island, New York. So basically he was sent by ship to New York, and then from New York he's going to be sent to a prisoner of war camp at that time. You can imagine from one major port to another major port, then usually to a rail line to a prison camp. Now this is another copy from the revised regulations of the 1861 U.S. Army regulations dealing with prisoners. Take a look at the second paragraph. All private property of prisoners will be duly respected and shall be treated in regards due to his rank. So it's not a case where if a soldier was captured, they basically took all of his gear away from him and said, all right, you're on your own. Normally that did not happen. In the Union Army, that normally did not happen. Now in the Confederate Army, there are cases where prisoners were taken and their equipment was taken from them because of the poor supply situation of the Confederate Army at that time. As a good example is after the Battle of Chickamauga, when Union prisoners were taken, a lot of the men lost their coats, their shoes, their equipment because the Confederate Army didn't have any equipment, so they took from the prisoners that were in the field at that time. So this is a case where the prisoners had to, their private property was being respected, but yet there was also a situation where they were not receiving their equipment at that time. Also, another thing that was considered going on at the time, both armies attempted to properly take care of their, quote, brothers in arms. You'll read accounts of prisoners that there's a big difference from a prisoner being taken by a reservist or a prisoner being taken by a combat veteran. If a combat veteran takes prisoners and were guarding prisoners who were fellow veterans as well, there was a bond, kind of like a fellow brothers in arms. We both kind of saw the elephant. We survived being shot at. We're kind of like bros in a way. We're going to kind of take care of each other. Now, unfortunately, when you have like home guard or reservist units, they actually took their aggression out on the prisoners themselves. But the armies attempted to try to properly take care of these prisoners. Unfortunately, the press, both North and South, accused both Union and Confederate armies of what's called coddling the prisoners, which means you're going to spend all your money to feed these men who have spent all this time to try to overthrow our government. So really the press necessitated the harsher treatments at the prisoner of war camps during the war. Also a situation too that the Union commandant of the prisoners, he had been a prisoner in Texas in 1861, and as a result of his poor treatment by the Texas State Guard, he kind of turned around and took it out on the Confederate prisoners that was under his care through 62 to 65. Also to keep in mind too, in the sense of the Confederate government, the poor supply situation of the Confederate government made it even worse for the prisoners that were in their stead. Because if they could not feed their own soldiers, how are they going to feed their prisoners as well? And this is gets aggressively worse in 1863, 64, and 65. Here's a letter that was written from Camp Johnson by from Private Collection 129, Thomas Keenan papers. Thomas Keenan was the colonel of the 43rd North Carolina. Now, prisoners who were taken up north, they would have their own accounts. So if they wanted to buy food from the settlers or buy equipment, really like a coat or blanket, they could buy it from the settler. Well, unfortunately, during the war, some of these soldiers' accounts disappeared. These monies disappeared that were in their stead, and this is a letter that was written after the war, and the Keenan papers basically saying, what happened to the money? What happened to the money that we had in prison? Why was it gone? It was also described that dealing with a situation where they felt like they should have been receiving back pay. Since the Confederate government lost, the U.S. government should be paying them back pay they should have received when they're in prison camp, and this letter addresses that as well. If you look at the microfilm that we have in the search room of the State Archives in Record Group 249, we do have account books where prisoners had their information written down, like we went to the settler and we bought a coat, we bought a biscuit, we bought coffee, something like that to try to make their lives better. Interesting enough, at the beginning of the war, when prisoners were sent to Elmira, New York, they was actually allowed to go into town and open up bank accounts in downtown Elmira, New York. So they could actually leave the prison camp, go into town, deal with their fiscal business, and come back to camp. And this is like 62, before the war really got really serious in that regard. Now, in 1862, the idea of the exchange system came into effect, and what the exchange system was, and this event was also brought about from the press, dealing with the situation where people were writing in and saying, well, my brother, my father, my son had been captured. I want him to be sent back home again. And why ain't you doing anything to bring him back home again? So the whole idea of an exchange system came into effect, and what this was an exchange system operated at Aiken's Landing. This is a photograph from the Library of Congress of Aiken's Landing on the right-hand side, and the steamboat that was used to ferry the exchange prisoners across the James River at Aiken's Landing. And what happened was they would come up with a complex formula where, let's say, a lieutenant was worth 5 privates, or a sergeant was worth so many privates, or some kind of exchange system where Confederate prisoners were exchanged for Union prisoners, the same equal amount based on that formula they came up with. And interesting enough, this went back to the exchange system that was set up between the British and the Americans excuse me, during the War of 1812. So they used the same idea, and they just kind of moved it forward to the Civil War. Now, unfortunately, some generals in the Union Army realized, well, we're trying to win the war by use of overwhelming manpower, so what we're doing is we're taking guys captured and we're sending them back into Confederate service. One good example of that was Colonel Blackburn, who was in Stewart's cavalry. He was actually captured, exchanged, captured again, exchanged again. So basically this trained officer was basically sent back to his own unit twice during this time period. So you can think about a lot of Confederates will get captured and then get themselves exchanged back. There's also a concept where Confederate units will have a straggler out there who will let himself get captured by the Union Army, and when he did, he would give erroneous information to the Union Army saying, oh yeah, we got 4,000 guys on the other side of this hill, and realizing that he's going to get exchanged, he'll be back to his unit within about 4 or 5 months on that. Now, this whole system went into place really, if some started in December of 1861, January 1862, it really didn't come full-blown until January 22nd, 1862. It lasted until May 25th, 1863, because the federal government realized all we're doing is just giving the Confederate Army more men back. And think about it too, you're not just giving them men back, you're giving them combat veterans that are back. So you got guys who know how to fight, and you give them back to the Army. And during this time is when the rise of prison population started occurring because of the stopping of the exchange program. Here's another letter from PC 129, the Thomas Keenan papers. This is a letter from Thomas Keaton. Thomas Keaton and some officers wrote to the commandant at Camp Johnson, or Johnson's Island, Ohio, saying, well, since exchange is coming up, we get to pick who's going to be exchanged. And then this is a letter from the commandant back to Colonel Keaton, saying, no. We're the ones who are in charge of the prison camp, not you. You don't tell us what to do. So this is the front page of that letter he started writing back to the Confederate prisoners saying, no, I get to pick who's going to be exchanged. You don't get to pick who the exchanged prisoners are. So you kind of see this kind of give and take are starting to happen in the Confederate prison, in the Civil War prisons in 62 and 63. Now I want to show you this chart while we're kind of going along in our presentation here of the types of Civil War prisons. This is actually from Lonnie Spears' The Portals of Hell, Military Prisons of the Civil War, published in 1997. It kind of gives you a breakdown of what kind of prisons were used during this time. Really, some of the first prisons we ever used were existing prisons. They were like county jails, city prisons, where you had to put soldiers in. So if you had to put them in prison, go to the county jail. You already got bars on the window. You ain't got to do anything, right? Just stick them in prison. So then you started using coastal fortifications like Fort Delaware. There was no idea, no sense that the Confederate Navy was going to actually attack a northern city, so these fortifications were necessarily unusable except as prison camps. Old buildings were also used, like Libby Prison. Libby Prison was formerly a tobacco warehouse that was used because they needed space in downtown Richmond near the James River. Another good example is Salisbury Prison. It's not really under that time period. Salisbury Prison was a former cotton mill, and it had a compound, and that compound was used for prisoners. Then you also have barracks that were enclosed by high fences. Johnson Island, Elmira, New York, and Raleigh, North Carolina. There was actually prisoners held in Raleigh, North Carolina. These were barracks that had high fences around them, or palisades, to keep the prisoners pinned into a certain area. You also have clusters of tents enclosed by high fences. Point Lookout is a good example of that, and we'll show you that as an illustration. Lastly, we have barren stockades, and these are good examples are Andersonville and Salisbury and some of the later Confederate prisoner war camps in the South. The Confederates didn't have the equipment to build barracks. They didn't have the equipment to really build military barracks for prisoners, so what they did was they took a piece of land, put a big palisade around it, put the prisoners in that area, and that was it. So a lot of times you see prisoners digging holes to make their own places to live in the ground because of a lack of some kind of shelter around them. Here's an example of Fort Delaware that's on the Chesapeake Bay. This is an existing fortification that was turned into a military prison. During the period of 1861-1865, this particular facility here held 12,600 prisoners. Roughly 52 prisoners escaped during this time, but 2,460 prisoners died at this particular locality. Fort Delaware is also known for what's known as the Morris Island or the Gallant 600 event that happened in 1864. What happened was there was Union prisoners that were in Charleston, South Carolina, and what the Confederates did was they took the Union prisoners and kind of scattered them around downtown Charleston and throughout their fortifications. So when Charleston was getting bombarded from the sea, they would not be likely to fire into Charleston thinking they're going to hit their own prisoners because they're scattered throughout the city. So the federal government decided, well, if you can do this, we can do this as well. It's kind of like a tit-for-tat kind of thing. So they picked 600 prisoners from Fort Delaware and sent them to Morris Island. This is the palisade here at Morris Island. Interesting enough, the unit they actually stored these prisoners at Fort Wagner. If y'all remember the movie Glory with the 54th Massachusetts, the palisade was built outside of Fort Wagner. And interesting enough, the unit that was guarding the prisoners was the 54th Massachusetts. It was on guard detail during this time. Now these prisoners stayed here through till October 23rd, 1864, when they realized, okay, this is enough. Let's just go ahead and just call this thing off. So the prisoners were then sent to Fort Pulaski, and then they eventually got moved back up north. Interesting enough, these 600 prisoners did not get released until 1866, before they were sent home. The book you see on our left-hand side here, this is actually from the PC-22, the John Lucas Cadwell papers. This is a memorandum book that actually lists all the prisoners that were sent to Morris Island from Fort Delaware, their units, the states they're from, and their rank. And interesting enough, it was so important, if you see the stamp on the front of the book, it was actually copied by the War Department after the war as part of their way of trying to document what happened during the what they call the War of Rebellion or the American Civil War. We also have Camp Johnson. Camp Johnson was considered to be the ideal prison because it was on an island off of Sandusky, Ohio. It was in existence from 1862 to 1865. Roughly 3,256 prisoners were held here. There was 12 escapes, believe it or not. They thought that being on an island that would keep prisoners from escaping from this locality, but that didn't stop them. They still was able to get off the island. They had over about 235 deaths here. We have a flyer you see on the side. This is from Private Collection 762, from the James I. Metz papers. This is a flyer done by the Rebel Thespians. It's a drama. They actually raised money for the people who had smallpox at the prisoner of war camp. If you see down at the bottom, they had another flyer going down dealing with the Battle of Gettysburg. It's their way of kind of doing a play to try to raise funds for the people who were worse off in the prison wards at the particular prisoner of war camp. Point Lookout, you can see the locality. We talked about the palisade with tents around it. You see that right down at the end at Point Lookout, Maryland. This particular prisoner of war camp that was a Union prisoner of war camp held 22,000 prisoners. Roughly 50 prisoners escaped from this locality, but they had over 3,584 deaths at this particular prison. As you can tell, it's right on the coast, so it's subject to any of the storms and the winds coming off the island. And if you think about it, for Confederate prisoners, if you have a prisoner, if you're from, let's say, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, you're from a Gulf Coast state, you're not used to cold weather. You're not used to kind of like the weather we've been having here lately, you know, the 17 degrees, wind chill factor down to 2 degrees below zero. It was hard on these men. Vice versa, it was hard for a prisoner who was from New York or Ohio who was used to 17 degrees of weather. Now he's in Georgia with 100-degree weather with like 98% humidity. So if you can think about the weather conditions on these prisoners, that's a lot of it what helped to facilitate such high death rates at these particular prisoner of war camps. Also at Point Lookout, the commandant of this camp was Captain Colonel Schroff, was a German, I believe. He actually was one of the most worst commandants that was employed by the Union Army during this time. He actually was not very kind to his prisoners. So that may have also accounted for the high death rate at this particular prisoner of war camp. We have from PC 148 from the Kemsley papers. This is actually a release from Point Lookout. You can tell it's a two-side document. On one side is the soldier's oath of allegiance. He's from Henderson County. It was Mitchell F. Kemsley. This is his oath of allegiance, saying he would not raise arms against the United States again. And the second part of it was his past, saying that basically he's a released prisoner from Point Lookout. At the end of the war, when the war was over and they started to release prisoners, you would think that most prisoners received some kind of transportation back to the South. Basically what they did was they opened up the gates and said, go home. So these guys had to find their way back home again. And some made it home and some did not make it home. So sometimes if you're doing research on a soldier who was captured and was sent to a prison camp and he never got home again, he could be he was so sick that when he tried to come home, he died. And somebody buried him and they didn't know who he was, and he was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. We also have dealing with Confederate prisoners as well as Camp Sumter in Andersonville, Georgia. Interesting enough, there were North Carolinians that were actually held at this particular prisoner of war camp. This prisoner of war camp held 32,899 prisoners. There was 329 escapes. And unfortunately, there was 127,900 deaths at this particular prisoner of war camp. The letter you see on your left-hand side is from Private Collection 1058. This is actually a letter written by Patrick Winston to have a North Carolina citizen release. An elderly man named T.S. Everett was at Plymouth, North Carolina, when Plymouth was taken by Confederate Major General Robert F. Hoke. And when he was captured in Plymouth, he was sent to Andersonville with all the other Union soldiers at the same time. And he was actually writing a letter to the Secretary of War to try to find some way of getting this elderly man released from Andersonville. Now, unfortunately, we do have a roll of those prisoners we know who died at Andersonville. And I went to check it this morning to kind of wondering if he ever get home again. Unfortunately, his name is not listed as one of the ones that were buried down there, and there's just a large number of unknown deaths at Andersonville. We never know if this particular TS ever got home again. So it was a situation where if you were a Unionist, especially a Southern Unionist, and you was captured, vice versa, if you was a Copperhead or a pro-secessionist in the northern states, you may get captured, you may be arrested, and you may be sent to a military prison as well. And you may have the same kind of fate that the soldiers had in the prisoner of war camp at the same time. We have Salisbury Prison. Salisbury Prison, interesting enough, was started about early 1862, 1861. Jefferson Davis actually wrote then Governor Henry Toole Clark saying, you know, we need a place to put prisoners at because we're starting to capture prisoners in the field. Do you have a place we could use? Salisbury was a former cotton mill and was actually converted into a prison war camp. Interesting enough, it kind of got started as a place to put pro-Unionists and Confederate prisoners who, you know, did things like slap the first sergeant or, you know, got drunk in town and, you know, basically stuff they got arrested for you shouldn't be doing in the first place. So these prisoners were sent to Salisbury Prison. Well, eventually it started receiving more Union Army prisoners as opposed to the Confederate prisoners as well. About 10,321 prisoners were held here. These consist of Union Army soldiers as well as pro-Unionists from North Carolina. Roughly about 500 escaped. Believe it or not, there are some books talking about they still find escape tunnels in Salisbury from time to time when doing work in the old part of Salisbury. Unfortunately, 3,700 men died at this particular prisoner of war camp. Salisbury really didn't become really a problem in terms of prisoners until October of 1864 when they started running out of room at Andersonville, so they started transferring prisoners either from Andersonville or from other localities to Salisbury Prison. Interesting enough, in November of 1864, they actually had a riot at Salisbury Prison. Enough Union soldiers got together and got tired of not being fed. They decided they were going to rush the gate. So one day when they did what's called a guard mount or a guard change, they actually rushed the gate and actually took the gate. Unfortunately, there was a bunch of senior reservists who was guarding the camp at the time. They actually took their muskets and was getting ready to charge into town. But unfortunately, one, they didn't coordinate that with all the other prisoners at the same time, and two, they didn't have enough ammunition, so once they fired 1 or 2 rounds from their muskets, they didn't have any other ammunition. And by that time, another Confederate unit had come up with an old 8-pounder cannon and fired basic grape shot into the prisoners and forced the prisoners back in the camp. They did arrest the ringleaders and sent them to Richmond and actually tried to start dispersing the population at that time. Now, one of the records we do have available for someone who are doing research for Union Army prisoners who were Confederate prisoners at the time, we have what's known as a Roll of Honor. This was actually published after the war in 1866. And this is a listing of people they knew who died at prison camps, Confederate prison camps that were in the South. And this is a big deal because if you think about it, if you had a relative who went to war in a, let's say, a New York regiment, a Philadelphia regiment, Pennsylvania regiment, Ohio regiment, he never came home, he could be on this roll at Andersonville, Salisbury, or Macon, or another camp as itself. I made a copy of one of the pages from Salisbury. If you take a look at the prisoner number 300, and I think it was 360, my eyesight's not that good, so you have to bear with me. K. Noble, he was a citizen from North Carolina. He was actually captured, arrested in North Carolina, and sent to Salisbury Prison. And unfortunately, he died on January the 24th, 1865, of inflammation of the chest with chorea, kind of like inflammation of the chest, kind of like respiratory infection. So there are situations where North Carolina citizens ended up in prisoner of war camps as well for their political views. As you can also tell by looking up the list, troops from the U.S. colored troops also ended up in prison camps as well. Most of those are the lucky ones because most of the times if an African American was captured on the battlefield by a Confederate soldier, a lot of times he was killed. Or in some cases, if he was killed, if he was captured, he might be sold back into slavery. There were situations where freedmen from Boston were captured and sold into slavery into Texas, but thinking that well, these are obviously blacks. They should be slaves. So they were resold even though they were born freeborn in Boston, Massachusetts. So here's another good example of doing another source to do research at this time. There's also other prisoners as prisoner of war camps as well. Now, one thing, if you take a look at Charlotte, Goldsboro, Greensboro, and Raleigh, what do you think is the one thing that ties all four of these sites together? Do we have guessed or anything? That's it. Absolutely right. There's our main rail line running through all four sites. And that's the key thing to remember about Civil War prison camps. There's always a rail line or some kind of transportation way of getting people to a prison camp, whether by ships or by railroad. So there's a major railroad running through Charlotte, Goldsboro, Greensboro, and Raleigh. So as a result, these places became localities for prisoners. Now, interesting enough, the prisoners from Goldsboro and Greensboro, which are 64, 65, and 65, a lot of these are prisoners that were captured in eastern North Carolina. For example, a lot of prisoners were captured during the first day of the Battle of Bentonville from 14th Army Corps. And a lot of these prisoners ended up in Greensboro because the rail line, they got them on the rail line. The Confederates had lost Goldsboro at the time. They couldn't take them to Raleigh because Raleigh was too close to the front lines, so you send them to Greensboro. And interesting enough, you go to Battleground Avenue in Greensboro, there's actually a historical marker for the prison camp. It really wasn't a prison camp, it was really more like a pen. They just kept the prisoners in that part of Greensboro at the time. Same thing for Charlotte. Now, interesting enough with Charlotte, they had prisoners that actually were sent there from Andersonville Prison. In February of 1865, they actually brought the exchange system back in effect, and a large number of prisoners from Andersonville were sent to Wilmington, North Carolina, was actually exchanged at that time to Major General Alfred Terry's 10th Army Corps. They just recently took Wilmington, North Carolina. So some of these prisoners was in transit from Andersonville to Charlotte to Wilmington or to Greensboro, from Salisbury to Greensboro to Wilmington as well. This is a release. We talked a little bit about releases, but prisoners were released and basically the door opened up and just basically said, you need to go home and find your own way home. There was not really no transportation given for prisoners at this time. So a prisoner would receive a release either from the Provost Marshal's office. Here's a prisoner from the top up here from one of our private collections, I think it's the Heck Papers, where he received a parole prisoner through the military lines in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is also from the Heck Papers, I believe. I wanted to show this one because this is really nice because a lot of Army units had their own printing presses when they went into the field, and this is one that was operated by the 6th Army Corps at the end of the war, so they had received their parole to get home through that. We'll talk a little bit about galvanized units, whether galvanized Confederates or galvanized Yankees. One thing I will suggest you take a look at the work of galvanized Yankees. This is where Confederate prisoners were basically enlisted into the Union Army and sent out west to fight the Native Americans or Indians at the time. So a lot of these units were basically raised regiments to be sent out into the west to fight the Indians, to free up troops to be sent back east to fight the Confederate Army. So that book, I would recommend reading that to get some idea, get some background about that. I wanted to also show a picture of Battle of Bentonville. Now, interesting enough, there is a growing sense of bibliographical research or historiographical research dealing with galvanized Confederates. And interesting enough, it's found out now that some of these galvanized Confederates, which are Union prisoners who were in prison camp who enlisted in the Confederate Army, some of these used this as a way of getting back to the Union Army. Now, the reason why I want to bring this up is one time there was an apocryphal story dealing with the first day of the Battle of Bentonville of a Union staff officer who was directing the Union advance near the Harper House, and all of a sudden this prisoner showed up saying, hey, you better be aware because this Confederate, Joseph E. Johnson's whole Confederate Army is facing you right now. And they kind of dismissed it as the whole idea we talked about the Confederate deserter who's going to give misleading information to the Union Army so he can get captured, till the staff officer recognized the particular soldier as being a friend of his from Syracuse, New York. And come to find out that particular prisoner, he was in a New York regiment, was captured and sent to Andersonville, figured out, I'm going to get out of camp by joining the Confederate Army, and once I get close to the closest Union unit, I'm going to basically go over to the other side. Now, this was always an apocryphal story. It was always like, yeah, it sounds good. It was a great story. It sounded really great. Well, interesting enough, this particular story is starting to become true now, because we're now starting to find census information that's actually backing up the prisoner and the staff officer actually lived in the same neighborhood in Syracuse, New York. And interesting enough, the first unit they joined up in, they both served together in the same unit. So the story is starting to become more plausible now, so it's going to bear some more research to see if this actually is the case. But there are cases where Union soldiers did enlist in the Confederate Army. Now, their first idea of doing this was, we're going to get the Irish to sign up because the Irish really don't like anybody, so we can get them to sign up for money. Well, that didn't work out too well, so now it came to a situation where if you're at Andersonville and you didn't have anything to eat, this is a good way to find a way of getting something to eat until you can find a way to desert back to your own forces at that time. I want to talk about aftermath, and use my image for that is this particular individual here. Does anybody know who this is? I ask a lot of questions in my talks. I need to give away free candy, and y'all will be motivated. This is Thomas Corbett, otherwise known as Boston Corbett. Boston Corbett was the man who killed John Wilkes Booth. According to the story, he was at the 16th New York Cavalry. They surrounded John Wilkes Booth in the barn. He took out a Colt revolver and aimed it through the cracks of the barn, not really through the cracks of the barn, but outside the cracks of the barn, fired a shot, struck John Wilkes Booth in the back of the head, severed his spinal column, and basically he died later on that day. Now, the interesting story about Corbett is, and why I wanted to show him as an example of aftermath, is that he was also at Andersonville Prison as well. Corbett was actually served in the 16th New York in Virginia, was captured by Mosby's raiders, and was sent to Andersonville Prison for 4 or 5 months before he finally was exchanged in February of 1865. And when he was, once he got back to the Union Army, he had probably got given a furlough a couple of days, and then was sent back to his unit, which was the 16th New York, which was one of the units trying to capture the conspirators after the Lincoln assassination. Now, he suffered with mental problems throughout his life, and he actually moved to out west and died out west. He also tried to basically assassinate parts of the Kansas legislature after the war. And the story was the reason why he had mental problems was because he was a hatter, and hatters used mercury. And one of the stories is that the mercury kind of did an effect on his mind. Now, interesting enough, some of the publications out there that came out in 1867, 1868 by Union prisoners, they actually cite Andersonville as being the effect that he had on him. That when he was at Andersonville, one soldier they wrote a lot of after the war accounts of being in prisoner of war camps. And they actually talked about the fact that when he was at Andersonville, he kept talking about when he got out, he was going to be the avenging angel on the Confederate Army. So interesting enough, we don't know. He never wrote anything down. He died, mysterious causes. So we really don't know if that's what prompted Corbett to kill. When they said, don't shoot John Wilkes Booth, he shot him anyway. So we don't know if that was it, or if he really was, the mercury just played an effect on his mind. But you have to understand that this had a large effect on a lot of the soldiers who served in the Civil War. And I wanted to bring that up because if you think about it, over 56,000 soldiers died in prison camps north and south. The U.S. Army held 67,500 prisoners. The Confederacy held 50,000 prisoners. So if you think about, even with the number of men who died, half this number died, the effect this had on the soldiers who served, who was captured, and then was sent back home again. We talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome. This could be a classic example of one right here that someone doesn't know anything about. I know some of the research I've done with prisoners, even as late as 1890, Union prisoners who were at Andersonville who fought against the Raiders. Now, what the Raiders were was basically a gang of thugs who went around and stole stuff from prisoners to either make themselves wealthy or be able to trade with the Confederate Army. So basically, a bunch of prisoners got together and basically attacked the Raiders, captured the ringleaders, hung them, and kind of scattered the rest of them. One prisoner wrote to another prisoner, one from New York to Ohio. They were friends at Andersonville, and he said, be careful because the Raiders are still out there, and they're still looking for you right now. Because this particular person he was writing to in New York, he actually was leader of the group that went against the Raiders. So think about it. Even in 1890, the fear of what happened at Andersonville was still playing a part of these soldiers later on. Whether it was true or not, whether anything ever came out of it, I've looked at the letters, I've not seen anything, but the whole idea of the threat still being there. And think about this, if you had the same situation having in Confederate and Union prisoner war camps too as well, some of the hard feelings that were brought up during prison camp kind of played out after the war between prisoners and guards themselves too as well. There's also a situation where sometimes they said that, for example, the burning of Columbia, South Carolina in February of 1865, now they think it was not burned by the Union Army, it was actually burned by Union prisoners who were released by the Confederate Army. So what they did was they took their revenge out on the town. Well, that's been proven. It's yet to be proven, concretely, but it's something to think about if you look about the human cost of this engagement. I also want to talk quickly about records. We don't have a lot of records at the State Archives dealing with prisoners and prisoner war camps. We have a lot of private collections of Confederate soldiers who were prisoners, but we do have at the National Archives Record Group 249 and the Confederate Record System Record Group 109. These are the records pertaining to Confederate and Union prisoners of war. We also have the Record Group 249 for Elmira Prison, Point Lookout, and Fort Delaware on microfilm in the search room of the State Archives. But the original records are at the National Archives. I was fortunate enough to go to the National Archives one time on one of my pet research projects, which one of these days will be completed, I hope. And the archivist was really nice to, kind of like we're fellow archivists kind of thing. He said, let me show you what we got downstairs. And she was actually going to take me to show me something completely, totally different. And I saw on the shelf the prison roll from Andersonville Prison for Camp Sumter on the shelf. So the records are there. They were collected by the Union Army afterwards, so we do have records available for those who want to do research at the National Archives. I also want to remember, don't forget our Civil War Sesquicentennial Committee, our website at the top up there, and also our own State Archives Civil War Sesquicentennial blog that we have that we're trying to post at least once or twice a month. So please keep up with that. We'll hopefully keep that going along until 1865. It's kind of like 1864 now, so it's kind of, we're getting in the, as I say, in the short rows at this time. And also, this is my contact information. This is me at a younger time when I was thinner and had I had more black in my beard, and I actually qualified for the senior reserves this year. So it tells you how old I am. So this is my contact information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, call me, or just holler at me. I can go by that too as well.